This screencast is about our unit of study on socialization. So what is socialization all about? It's a way that we learn about our life and our society. It's about how we identify a sense of self-concept and how we interact with people. This is a short video which demonstrates some of the negative side of social learning theory. Children see, children do, about the power of socialization with respect to our relationships with significant others in our lives. So, although this is a depiction of some negative consequences of observational learning, there are also normative behaviors that are pro-social, which we learn from our parents. Some of us may have relationships with our caregivers in primary socialization that are overwhelmingly positive. Some may be neutral, and some may have relationships with primary caregivers that produce antisocial behaviors. Different socialization experiences produce an internalization then of different norms and values. A key element of this process of internalization is a little bit of an emphasis on the idea that as developing creatures, we internalize norms so that they go into a kind of an unconscious realm. We're not really self-reflective about who we end up becoming in terms of our likes and our dislikes and so on. It's become second nature to us. So what is socialization? Without socialization, we don't really develop an opportunity to become ourselves, who we are. Essentially, from a broad perspective, socialization is about all of these influences around us: family, peers, religious communities, the media, work environments, social groups, the time and place we're born, the ethnicity that we're born into, and so on, all operate on us like we were a bit of an empty vessel. And at least in the initial phases, as we're acquiring our ability to abstract, use language, and start to define who we are, this has a huge impact on the developing sense of self. So to internalize is defined by the Oxford American Dictionaries to make attitudes or behavior part of one's nature by learning or unconscious assimilation. People learn, for example, things like gender stereotypes, what's appropriate for behavior for men and women, and so on. The operative word here is that, to a large part, at least in the early stages of socialization processes, primary socialization within the family, that we develop a lot of this sense of the emerging sense of self and our beliefs and our likes and our dislikes in a relatively unconscious kind of self-reflective fashion. Primary socialization is the socialization that occurs typically within the nuclear family, to some degree in the extended family. What it's characterized by is warm, nurturing, caring bonds that are really very quite powerful. So typically in relationships where primary caregivers and primary socialization is occurring are characterized by this warmth and nurturance and having your needs met, you develop people who have functional behaviors, pro-social behaviors. In environments where that caring and nurturance and basic needs aren't being met, you can develop dysfunctional behaviors and antisocial behaviors. To some extent, all of us are on a continuum somewhere in our primary socialization experiences between these two extremes, totally pro-social and antisocial. This leads us to a little discussion about the nature versus nurture debate. Overwhelmingly, I think sociologists would think that nurture, that all of the forces and influences in our environment that act on us like empty vessels and pour into us a lot of our ideas about what's acceptable behavior, what it is to be a man or a woman, what manners are, and so on, is a product of this socialization experience, the nurturing that we receive from the environment and the influence of all these behaviors. But the big debate, and a growing debate, is that nature or genetics also plays a large factor in shaping or determining our behaviors. And the more that we do in terms of research on physiology of the brain, the more that this argument is becoming controversial. So there is support, I think, in a discussion about socialization that supports both sides of these arguments. It's not necessarily an all or nothing approach. So, for example, in the case of feral children, we have a lot of evidence for nurture. There are children who are severely neglected by their parents, such that they're reared almost virtually in isolation, sometimes referred to as attic children. Feral children are tucked away in attics or left in cribs with chicken wire over them, with minimal contact with individuals, minimal ability to sort of move around, and they don't acquire a lot of learning. They don't acquire a lot of language. They have little ability to use abstraction and to think cognitively like most people. They don't engage in any kind of reflective self-talk. And when they've been recovered, supposedly either reared by animals or reared in isolation with minimal contact, they don't act like humans. They act like animals. They grunt and they groan. They defecate on themselves. They grovel and they scrape. They claw up their food and eat, and they make noises. They don't speak. So in this case, and the evidence is that people need people. A strong case for nurturance, and a strong case for the impact of socialization and the interaction that we have with other people in shaping who and what we become. In fact, the things that actually define our human characteristics: language and cooperating with other people. So one of the oldest stories is been recounted as an coined term for it is the Wild Boy of Aberon, and this young lad was found supposedly raised by wolves, and he was taken up as a cause célèbre for an individual who tried to rehabilitate him, but only got him so far in his development. So addict children and feral children have a lot of developmental markers that are way behind other children who were brought up in warm and nurturing environments. They haven't grown as much or gained as much weight. They don't have any kind of cognitive abilities. They may not walk. And their level of coordination and their use of language just may not be existent. Nicolae Ceausescu was an oppressive Romanian dictator, and there were a number of issues that were evident in children that were orphaned and raised in orphanages, and they were significantly neglected, and they had issues both in terms of their mental and their physical development. So a conclusion from the nurture side is that socialization is a bit of a biological imperative. Without human contact, children do not develop themselves as people. And there are a couple of clips here, full story dramatization of the wild child, the wild boy of Aberon, and a little bit of a shorter version of the movie. You can watch that at your leisure. On the side for the case for nature, the strength of biology in terms of shaping our identity or our understanding of who we are involves a tragic case of a twin. His name was David Reimer. He and his brother were undergoing a circumcision, and the tool used to cauterize the foreskin and sort of burn it off or peel it off was not calibrated correctly, and it was way too much voltage and essentially cooked for David's penis. It burnt so badly that it fell off. So along came a Dr. Money, whom his parents saw on a TV show, who had a specific theory about how you can socialize a person and do a gender reassignment, a sex reassignment on a child through the power of nurturance. So they consulted with Dr. Reimer, the parents of or Dr. Money, the parents of David Reimer, and they decided to undertake changing David's name, dressing him in girls' clothes, and for all intents and purposes doing everything that would be like gender-specific socialization for a female. And it was Dr. Money's belief that you could nurture a, technically a biological male to become female. Unfortunately, for David, um, he always knew there was something wrong. He always understood that he was a boy, and as he grew up, a man. And his case and his interaction with Dr. Money is quite tragic. You can watch the full video here if you'd like to know more of the story. But the experiment was a failure. David Reimer's sense, by his biological imperative, he simply understood that the strength of that sense in him was that he was a boy. So on the other side, here's a strong case for arguing that nurture has a significant impact on our developing sense of identity. In this case, sex assignment was something that couldn't be reassigned by gender-specific socialization. Unfortunately, the tragic result for David Reimer was that he ended up committing suicide sometime in his late 30s. The self and socialization. Sigmund Freud had a very significant theory of interaction and the development of self as part of his psychoanalysis. Infants demand some immediate gratification, and when their demands are denied, they begin to develop a sense of self. In this way, children learn that they need to balance their demands. The id is the kind of unrestrained, if I cry, I get my diapers changed. If I'm hungry and I stomp my feet, I get fed. Children learn through delayed gratification that they get to separate themselves out and develop other aspects of their personality, like their superego and their ego. And they develop then a personal conscience about appropriate social behaviors. Charles Horton Cooley has a powerful concept that's called the looking glass self, and really effectively it's a way in which we perceive ourselves that's based on our interaction with other people. It's a socialization process. We see that through the behavior of other people, we see ourselves by the nature and the quality of their interactions with us. We understand if we're valued as people, if people take our needs into consideration, and by the nature of their interactions, the warmth, the things that they tell us, the positive affirmations they give us, we develop a healthy positive self-concept as a reflection through their behavior. Or if we are neglected and we are called names, if we're verbally abused, we develop a poor sense of self-concept. So this is Charles Horton Cooley's famous looking glass self-concept. And essentially, we end up developing different kinds of sense of self depending on how we think other people see us. And it's an interactive thing. Not only is it about how people treat us, but it's also about how we perceive people are treating us. So how my mom and dad see me, I may have a different sense of myself and my level of confidence as opposed to how I think my older brother sees me, and so on. So we might have many selves that develop as a consequence of this looking glass self interaction with other people. Just a little bit more of a graphic image on how the looking glass self works. Another major concept in socialization process is that of George Herbert Mead's taking the role of the other, and he talks about 3 stages that children go through. An imitative stage, where we have the inability to actually take on a role, but we imitate, say, shaving when we don't have any hair, or baking with our moms when we don't really know how to do measures and proportions and mix. And then we have the play stage, the ability to adopt roles of significant others, sort of imaginatively put ourselves in those things like playing school. And then the game stage, where, and here's an example of people who are playing volleyball in middle school. People have to have a sense of who a person who is a setter is, a libero, and who is going to actually be smashing the ball over the net, and where we stand and what we do. We need this sense of a generalized other and an ability to coordinate our behavior with other people in games. So games, according to people who are coaches in particular, are always considered to be good preparation for life because they anticipate this idea of who we are in terms of taking on or understanding the role of the other in relation to us. The biggest way I like to think about this is that I was a tyke when I played hockey. Today they have Timbits, but when kids don't have the kind of language capabilities or the experience playing hockey, what you see is 10 little tykes all going into a corner and chasing the puck. They don't really understand the role of a defenseman in relation to a center, a left winger, and a right winger. That's something that evolves over time as they acquire more language and learn what the roles are respective to each other. In the concept of the I and me, the objective element of the self, the me, we first imagine ourselves from the perspective of others and make us aware of our social selves. And the I is a subjective or active part of the self. It allows us to react to and assess ourselves. It leads us to engage in internal conversations. And we have a classic sense of, we have this character from Lord of the Rings. His name is Gollum. And he has, inside him, he has a character that's kind of representative of the I. This I is a person who is kind of the dark side of him, and he engages in this self-talk with himself in a very kind of a funny way. Our experience then involves continuous conversations between the me and the I, and one of the things that we can actually do is we can self-stigmatize. We can actually have an impact on our own emerging sense of self by the negative self-talk that we give ourselves. Paul Willis starts to talk from kind of a symbolic interactionist perspective about the idea that although when we start out in socialization, the empty vessel model might work really quite well, something that happens in primary socializations, we're quite dependent on people and we have limited capabilities. And so a lot of those influences are very strong and powerful. But as we grow older, as our ability to abstract increases, our thinking gets more cognitively complex, and we're able to engage in self-talk, we can start to act back on these forces and not automatically follow the norms. We can end up being people who act back on the systems that affect us and creatively become our own selves. So Lady Gaga and her fashion statements might be something that you could consider as an angle on that. But above and beyond that, the idea of socialization as constraining still exists. As much as we can creatively reconstruct ourselves, a lot of kids do that when they go from high school to college or university. There still is a lot of constraint in terms of how we largely internalize sets of norms about gender, about what it is to be a man or a woman. So lots of gender ideas are socially constructed realities. The language we use to refer to ourselves, the emotional language we use, how other people interact with us, what we wear, what we consider to be attractive or unattractive, how we behave, the roles we play, or the jobs that we think are appropriate for men or women. One family that's trying to emancipate themselves from the norms is raising a child they call Storm. They didn't even want to announce when Storm was born what sex he was. They wanted to raise him in a gender-neutral environment. And in my notes, I've got a little bit of a story about Storm talking in his baby talk. Goes to his dad and refers to dad as mom, another nurse, and then slips in to be breastfed by his dad. And his dad, not wanting to be stigmatizing, actually allows him to do that. And Storm suckles on his dad's breast for a couple of minutes, and the parents aren't judgmental about that, reacting all over the place. And what they're trying to do is envision a world where we raise people without any kind of value judgments about what's gender appropriate behavior. And Storm ends up using mom, as a word that is representative of anybody that actually provides some kind of nurturance or comfort. So they consider that the environment that they're raising their child in is very emancipating of gendered norms in our society. Another area of concern about socialization experiences that also ends up on the empty vessel side of things. Well, back here, we're talking about being emancipating from cultural constraints, but in this instance, what we're talking about is hypersexualization of female children in particular, and how the age of this sexualization is getting pushed down to kids who are partaking in all sorts of things, the fashion industry, um, tiaras and toddlers, young kids in pageants, dressing provocatively, behaving provocatively, uh, in ways and understanding what it is to be dressed in a way that's sexually provocative without actually even having reached the age of puberty. In our society, this hypersexualization seems to be occurring at an earlier and earlier age. And that's a powerful influence on people shaping their identities and understanding themselves in terms of their behaviors and how they dress and how they interact with other people. So this sexualization of children, question you might ask yourself, is this overt objectification of women as sex objects, is that getting pushed down to a younger and younger age? And what does that do? Does that reproduce patriarchy in our society? To what extent are we actually doing this to men? I'm not going to, there are examples that we can talk about with respect to men, but are they overtly hypersexualizing men? And is it a gendered experience? Is this happening more to women than it is to men? So here's a 10-year-old girl that appeared on the cover of French Vogue magazine in 2011. What's really interesting about this cover is the idea that the profile consumer for this magazine is not really an 11-year-old girl. So what is this about? And then we have women who are comparing themselves to models that appear in magazines that actually, well, that gets to standards of beauty. Um, it creates unfair comparisons. How does a 28-year-old woman make a comparison of how she looks to an airbrushed 11-year-old? All right. Adolescence, youth socialization. Adolescence is quite a time of turmoil for children. They're engaging in all sorts of things. They're trying to establish separate identities from their parents. They're socializing more heavily with peers. They're dealing with changing bodies. They may be dealing with sexual orientation issues. They may be dealing with experimenting with drugs and alcohol. And something that's gone on with regard to adolescence and youth socialization is that adolescence is a socially constructed reality. Adolescence is a pretty modern construction. Adolescence is longer than it's ever been, and even many university students, for example, may go away from home to do their studies, but a lot of them are returning home. There's a term that's been used by sociologists to refer to graduates from university who are going home because they're still economically dependent and living at home and trying to get established in their careers as nesters. And nesting is something that's actually extended adolescence to a much larger extent than ever before. So back in the time when, say, French settlers came to Canada, young boys of 12, 13 were off as coeur de bois, and when women were able to menstruate and were in a position to have children, they got married, and they were fully fledged adults. So we're a long way in our society from people who are fully fledged adults, with the average person graduating from high school at about 18. The age of adolescence has been extended. Also, with regard to youth socialization, there are strengths in terms of influence. Adolescence is really quite new, but parental influences have certain strengths on a person's religious orientation, on their political preferences, on their career aspirations, and on their social class standing. One of the things that we know with regard to career aspirations and social class standing, as for instance, is that the bulk of people who are born into any of the socioeconomic status, if we just talk about three, lower SES, middle SES, and upper SES, is that although there is movement back and forth, there is some social mobility there. The majority of people, primarily through some of the influences of socialization, um, stay in those categories. Most SAS people of lower uh, income brackets stay there, middle income brackets stay there, and upper income brackets stay there. You can check out this little article on Harold Garfinkel and Garfinkeling and ethnomethodology and what those approaches are about. You can check out this little Easter egg. Okay, another significant concept in socialization is anticipatory socialization. It's the kind of thing that you do that when you're really looking forward to being in a role, but you're not really there. So there's very earliest examples of anticipatory socialization I mentioned already, and but if there most a lot of children, a lot of young adolescents in high school take co-op education. Co-op education is a great way to engage in anticipatory socialization. Uh, Practicums, unpaid internships, or if you're at university and you're studying to be a teacher and you go out and do practice teaching, all of these kinds of things are examples of anticipatory socialization. You're not fully qualified, you're not fully fledged person in an occupation, but you're anticipating those roles and getting some experience in them before you actually get there. Then there's adult socialization. Well, once you get that job, once you've done your internship and you get that job, you still are undergoing and continuously learning about your adult roles. And adult roles happen when you socialization continues when you get married, and adult socialization continues when you get a job, and adult socialization continues when maybe you decide you don't like your parents' religion and you want to engage in a faith community that's different from what you were raised in, and you will undergo a socialization process there. The world at work will give you socialization in training to the corporate culture, and then during the course of your work, organizations that you have employment with may restructure and have to reorganize, do some rationalizing and downsizing and re-engineering, and people will engage in all sorts of careers and jobs, go through a number of these processes, and be re-socialized or are being socialized again and again and again. So, for example, Starbucks has extensive training about their corporate culture and the kinds of things that people do. They have group sessions, they have videotape training, and they learn what it is to be a barista and how to provide customer service. Socialization is something that continues among older adults. A lot of older adults go through a significant transition, especially when they retire. They have to be socialized to changing sets of employment status, health standards, and taking on or trying to keep up new technologies and so on. And they do things to try and make their age less obvious as they're aging in the workforce by keeping up with things and learning and adapting to changing work environments. And ultimately, we are socialized right to death. The Tibetan culture has a book actually that's part of the process of socialization to death, understanding what the passing is from this life to another life, which is outlined in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And my own mother, God bless her soul, Olive, when she was passing away and she had stopped eating and stopped taking fluids, she was provided some in-home hospice care, and the hospice nurse actually spoke to her and coached her through the last stages of her life. So socialization can continue even until death. In terms of agents of socialization, family is probably the preeminent and most powerful influence on the socialization process because the child is dependent. They have little choice over the influences that they're exposed to. So if they're being neglected, they can't escape that. And if they are being verbally abused, they can't escape that. So all of these things, whether it results in warm and intimate relationships that are supportive, or something in between, or relationships that are about neglect and abuse, it still creates lasting bonds and has a significant impact on the development of our sense of self. In our families, the basic things that we learn are cognition and language, general norms and beliefs and values. We shape our basic attitudes about things, maybe about other groups, for example, or political orientations, capacity for intimate and personal relationships, and how we develop in terms of our self-image. So most often, despite some teenage revolution, children, how powerful is the agent of socialization represented by the family? Although most children go through kind of a period of teen rebellion, some experimentation, and so on, a lot of them reproduce what they learned as a youth and become adults much more like their parents. Then they end up being different from their parents. So one of the things that gets reproduced are a sense of families and social class. They have a tendency to reproduce that social class standing. Middle class parents instill middle class values. Working class parents instill working class values. Aspirations for income, occupation, and behaviors are all part of social class standings. So where you are in the status hierarchy, where you're born, has an impact on your life chances. And life chances is a sociological term about the opportunities that you get in your life, and they're significantly affected by families and social class standing. Further than that, there are specifically interesting sets of data about who gets involved in occupations with respect to, say, family and ethnicity. Ethnicity has a big impact on socialization. So there are very few Jewish Canadians, for example, that are going into policing and being firefighters. And Canadian Filipino youth and other Asian immigrants have huge demands that they place on their children for hard work and school achievement. Research shows that although there are lots of diverse family forms, from single parent moms, lone parent families, to blended families, to both biological parents and a nuclear family raising children, it's not so much about the diversity of the family form, the kind of family form you grow up in, that has an impact on your development and sense of self, how emotionally stable you are, what kinds of success you might have as a child in your later adult life. That's more dependent on what kind of financial, emotional, and cognitive support you get from your parents. The more enriched the environment that you grow up in, the better your chances of developing a healthy, pro-social kind of adult. Schools are also powerful socializing agents, and after the families, it's the school that have the most license to engage in socialization. We expect that. So one of the interesting things, a concept that's used by sociologists, is the hidden curriculum. Although education ostensibly is about the objectives and learning to read or write or define what discrimination and prejudice are, say in sociology, the bigger part of education is often seen as something that's called the hidden curriculum. There aren't any objectives written about this hidden curriculum, which is about going to school, being on time, getting your assignments done, going through school in cohorts. You're all in your kindergarten, you're 5 years old, and you move through as a cohort. So there's a heavy impact of socialization that comes from the structure. There's constraining structure there, which, and the way I like to talk about this is, this starts with Romper Room, which is a TV show that said, "I'm a romper room doobie." And really what a romper room doobie, this was not very much hidden curriculum in romper room with this kind of concept, but the idea of being a doobie is a person that do be what they should be doing. And that's being polite, being respectful of authority, participating in activities when you get asked to do it. School then adjusts children to the social order and how to fit into the social system. Another thing about school is that it's more objective. It's less personal, and in terms of judgments that can be made about your performance, it can be harsher than what happens in families. So it's seen as a good anticipation for adult roles, assuming the responsibility. Now, at some point, peer socialization in an adolescent's life becomes more important than the parents. And this has a big impact on tastes in music and on lifestyle issues. There's a little bit of research on in-groups and gangs and bullying and some of the reasons why individuals, although they may not actively engage in bullying, uh, may be bystanders and let some of it go on. It's a normative standard. Bystanders and witnesses may feel pressure to add to the bullying to take place that's taking place, or to fit in, or to do nothing about it. Other researchers say that peer pressure itself is a lot of bunk, and that essentially children do some of the things simply because they define that as something that they'd like to do, or the people that they're with, that's who they want to hang out with. When I was in grade 10, I participated in a United Nations, a Model United Nations activity, and that's when I had my first experience with dope. And what was going on was there's an after party celebration. It was in somebody's rec room. I had a couple of chaperones, a history professor, or history teacher, and a librarian. They were a couple. We thought they were pretty cool people. Anyway, some of the dope came out, and people were passing around joints, and I felt intensely uncomfortable. It was a hot room. I ended up feeling nauseous, and I asked them to take me home. At the time, Eric Burden's song "Down in Monterey," the Animals song "Down in Monterey" was playing. Mass media and new communication technology. The mass media has a big impact on the influences in terms of socialization, about what women are. So all of the things that affect us that are part of the mass media, and in a way is a bit of the we are empty vessels and being poured into by these omnipresent media technologies: television, radio, movies, CDs, newspapers, magazines, books, and of course all of the new social media. Does media violence affect or promote violent behaviors in children? Not all media violences reproduce the social order. Some of them break boundaries. For example, Gina Davis starred in a show where she was president in the U.S. But a lot of what the media does is reproduce existing notions of the social structure and the dominant ideology. Or the new technologies that are out there. Other socializing agents: religion. People are socialized in athletic teams, youth groups like Sparks, Cubs, Guides, Brownies, athletic teams, and other organizations which Irving Goffman referred to as people processing institutions. Schools are also people processing institutions. University is a people processing institution, but so are institutions which Goffman referred to as total institutions, where people end up being isolated from society and have a tightly regulated regimen. They get meals delivered to them. They have significantly routinized lives. They don't have to make a lot of decisions, and those things happen in psychiatric institutions, in correctional facilities, hospitals, and in the military boot camp. And so socialization experiences there can be rather dramatic. One of the things that prisons have been acknowledged as being is universities for more crime. Graduates out of this total institution often go on and commit more crimes. Recidivism rates are very high out of prisons. Hospitals socialize people even to a sick role. There's a different role and there's a different set of norms for people who are sick. So in our modern society, in simpler societies, in what Durkheim would have referred to as mechanically organic societies, relationships were relatively straightforward. The complexity, like the division of labor, wasn't so great. And you were born into a particular social class with very little mobility, very kind of rigid sort of a social structure. And if your father was a cooper, a barrel maker, well, you were a cooper or a barrel maker. And if your father was a member of the nobility and you were the son of a baron, a duke, or an earl, then you were a person who was a member of the nobility. If your father was involved with armed services, and that's what you did. It was relatively simple. But as societies have become more complex, uh, we have a greater division of labor, and we call that organic solidarity. Another Albert Twine's also coined a couple of terms as kind of a similar sort of a Ferdinand Twine's, pardon me, similar sort of a term which he referred to as Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, kind of the transition from simpler sort of societies to more organic societies. They have a lot more diversity. People's relationships to each other are not so simple and direct and mechanical, but they're more organic, and we have more chances for autonomy. So our society as a whole and the changes that have taken place in society have an impact on our identities and who we can become. Now, resocialization is the kind of thing that can take place in uh, a boot camp, where one of the things, what resocialization in things like cults have in common, and military boot camps, um, is that they have some kind of intensity, they have some kind of duration, and they have a certain kind of isolation. And what happens there is that you get re-socialized. So people who join cults, say for example like the Moonies, uh, will break off ties with other family members, and they will participate in mass weddings and then be sent off to do missionary work for 3 or 4 years before they're allowed to get together with their spouses and consummate their marriages and so on. And in boot camp, the primary goal of boot camp is to take people and make them follow orders, and ultimately one of those orders is to kill people. And we have a hard degree of consensus in our society that killing another human being is bad. It's almost universal. But in the military, we re-socialize people to an understanding that there are different expectations and norms for those individuals. One of the things that happens in going into a military or going into a convent or going into a psychiatric facility or going into a correctional facility is there's a form of status degradation. So from the movie Full Metal Jacket, one of the things that's representative of status degradation is to make everybody look the same. In boot camp, everybody gets their hair cut. Everybody gets put into the same uniform. Nobody gets to address their individuality. You end up being a cog in a wheel. And if you stick out somewhere or another, then you can be disciplined, motivated uh, by, by being punished. Resocialization, something that happens in cults like Scientology, where in my own experience, skipping school close to Toronto and be bopping up and down Yonge Street, being approached by uh, young Scientology people with some pamphlets trying to entice us into the Canadian Scientology headquarters, was to go on weekend retreats. And on a weekend retreat, one of the things that happens is that you don't get left alone. You get told to expect something. They will play on adolescence, a time of turmoil around any kind of identity issues they have or separation issues that they have from their parents, problems with authority, and they'll create an air of expectation that like we've got some answers for you, and and you're not, and you can't. They'll disorient you with respect to time. They'll take away your watch. They'll disorient you with respect to time even further by keeping you up late, changing your meal times, getting you up early, and then creating an experience at the end, which is about an all-encompassing kind of a love and support. You're not left alone, even when you go to the washroom. You're accompanied by somebody. So what they do is they recreate in a shorter space of time the kind of intensity, although with not the same duration, as a military boot camp. And that's one of the ways in which organizations like Moonies and Scientology get recruits. So a famous example of a cult involved a man named Jones, and he opened up a place in South America where he took his followers and decided there were issues or problems that were pursuing him, and several hundred people drank cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. In Heaven's Gate, 16 or 18 people believed that there was a spaceship following the Hale-Bopp comet, and they all, uh, dressed up in suits, laid down in bunk beds and drank some poison with the belief that they were jettisoning their bodies, their earthly bodies, and projecting themselves to the spaceship behind the Hale-Bopp, and they were going to ascend to the spaceship as evolved creatures, evolving to a higher state and moving on in their cosmic journey. So that's powerful forms of resocialization in the adult life.